Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Our spotlight today is on the work of a Vermont artist, Shanta Lee Gander. She has an exhibit at the UVM's Fleming Museum entitled Dark Goddess, an Exploration of the Sacred Feminine. These photographs in this exhibit ask visitors to consider who or what is a goddess. Gander joins us to talk about her work and answer a few of these big questions about goddesses, power, and agency. Welcome, Shanta.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So let's begin just by defining a couple of terms. How do you define the sacred feminine, and what do you mean by dark goddess?
So the sacred feminine really goes back to the idea of how we all began in terms of looking at the Neolithic, Paleolithic period, what happened with the demotion of the goddess as societies became quote unquote advance. So the most raw, the most primal sense of what it means to be feminine. And dark goddess, well, there's so many different definitions, but the main one I wanted to explore was around really taking back the term of goddess and also exploring it beyond just the pantheon that we tend to over rely on. You know, we tend to say, oh, women are, you know, they're either healers or they're the maternal, they're benevolent. And I wanted to explore the other pantheon across the world in terms of the goddesses who are fierce, the goddesses who may be a little bit like Saturn with their children in terms of devouring. So that's it, and the definition shifts and has shifted, as you've seen, depending on some of the collaborators and how they defined for themselves what it meant to be a dark goddess.
I love that you really collaborate with your model. So let's go to the exhibit, thanks to producer Keith Silva. It's in a very formal part of the Fleming Museum. It's in the marble court. And in this exhibit, there's the marble court. Pieces are all around the balcony. They're very strong. You draw attention in the exhibit to the concept of the male gaze. What is that term to you, and how does it factor into your work?
Well, you know, it's not originally, as we all know, it's not original to me. Laura Mulvey, filmmaker, talked about the fact that all cameras were inherently male. And so, in fact, if a camera was being pointed at a body, it was out of that lens of maleness. And so a woman's body, for example, becoming objectified, the work of John Berger, you know, culture critic, this is like 60s, 70s. And so one of the things I wanted to challenge is whether or not my gaze could be sort of like a reclamation. Do I have to internalize the male gaze, or could I bend it and challenge it, especially with the way that the models were not objects, but very active. Even the objects in and of themselves, I see them as active.
And they're looking right out at you, so the gaze is at the person that is gazing at your beautiful photographs also. And speaking of Ben, what do you want male visitors to take away from this exhibit?
Well, one of the things I do want people to keep in mind is that even though there is a movement to go beyond the binary, you know, rightfully so, I think it's important to know that it's helpful that we carry all these different energies within us, and that this isn't necessarily just about a reclamation for women, but it's also thinking about how can we break beyond how we define these things, and how do we break beyond some of the containers that society might try to put on us. So very briefly, the Morrigan, for example, very old, ancient Celtic goddess, but she actually breaks beyond just the role of feminine because of all the things she stands for.
Right, and this is so powerful for women too, to just see what are How can I expand my definition of
Yes.
who and what women can be? And you've been working on this concept of the dark goddess really for many years. Has your understanding changed or shifted over that time?
I think so because, well, before, I would say for about good 7 solid years, when I had this idea many years ago, I just put it on the shelf and just let it gestate. I thought, okay, I'd love to explore this, put it on a shelf. And then, of course, you know, the backstory where one of my model's collaborators kind of pushed me in 2020 and said, let's do a photo shoot. I still wasn't thinking of Dark Goddess. And I like exhibits not to be static, but to also continue to inform. And at first, I was so busy, you know, I was looking up and also looking at the everyday woman and how she wanted to redefine herself or define herself or reclaim and self-make.
Right.
And I think that shifted over time, like in terms of thinking, oh, actually, the Dark Goddess is so many things, even beyond, even in what I portrayed in my short film.
Yeah, this deep, intuitive piece also that you bring out. How talk about your collaboration between you as the artist photographer and the subjects that are featured in your photos.
Absolutely. So it was about an average of working with each person for about a month to world build, to think about who they wanted to be, not necessarily choosing someone out of a pantheon. Sometimes many have created themselves. Sometimes, as this photo here, for example, you see Eve, you know, and this person, Heather, wanting to reclaim Eve and take away that shame, almost like tapping into a little bit of Lilith energy as well, like I am myself kind of thing. And so it was really, even afterwards, then showing pictures to the individuals and saying, these are the ones I think could be chosen to be shown, getting their feedback to see what they like the most. And so it was truly a collaboration in every sense of the word, in addition to hearing their voices. This is, in this iteration, really interviewing them and saying, what do you think of how you were presented?
Right, there's this wonderful audio component to the exhibit where we can hear interviews of these women featured in the photos and what it meant to them. Why was that so important to include their voices?
Because I wanted another additional layer in terms of, you know, some of the questions of why was it important to be presented in a certain way? What was it like to be seen by me, as opposed to my perception of what it was like for them to be seen by me, rather than putting that on them, having them to define that. Also, what I wasn't prepared for were some of the personal stories of, you know, either, you know, the challenge to body dysmorphia, or, you know, a couple of individuals talk about being survivors of cancer and how this felt very powerful for them. And so I was sort of like open to this surprise that kind of just came in from those interviews.
Right. Let's look at a couple of specific photos. Here's the Crow Goddess. What's the story behind this shot, and who is the woman?
So this is Dawn Cherie McKenzie, and she's also a friend. And she's someone also who is amazing at costuming and is a musician, does so many different amazing creative things. And she had some amazing things to say about what it meant to be a dark goddess, to not be afraid of the darkness, the balance. She talked about the toxic positivity culture in very highly eloquent ways, and talking about what it meant to be a dark goddess is to hold each other to a standard of not forcing ourselves to be polite, especially when there is no room, that one shouldn't be forced to be polite when they should be really taking space. And so, yeah, that was a very fun, all of those shoots were really fun.
I bet they were. And equally as striking is the photo entitled Berserk. How does this image relate to the sacred feminine for you?
So it's interesting because, as people may know, in Viking history, mythology, the idea of the berserkers, or the berserk, where someone would literally enter a state for fighting, warriors. So in this way, and naming it Berserk, I kind of did some gender bending. Now, this is an interesting case where we just were doing a photo shoot. This is before I even thought of Dark Goddess. And this was one of the moments when I was looking at the photos and I thought, oh, I think I have Dark Goddess. I think I have the beginnings of Dark Goddess. And thought about a true berserker as pure feminine, righteous rage allowed, permitted. And so kind of taking that term and not just applying it to masculinity.
I love that. So in addition to these photographs, we're running through time, you're also using pieces in the Fleming collection for another smaller installation that's called Objects Defied. I love it. It's a great title. Talk about the similarities and differences between these two exhibits where you're using things from the museum to explore the Dark Goddess and other things.
Absolutely. I think that representations of the feminine body, also right down to what's put on the body, clothing, also especially representations of the other from around the world. How have we often seen women in their bodies? And then when you apply the intersectional lens, how have we further defined or contained the feminine body? Or so for example, you see the bound foot, you see beneath. So really looking at this wide expansion, I was interested in a multifaceted approach, multimedia approach of exploring sacred feminine.
And quickly, the artifacts change when they're in a museum and they're removed from their context. So that is so interesting how you explored that as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I wanted to just briefly have the objects disrupt the gaze and question people about what they thought they were seeing, and then question themselves about how much they were containing themselves to kind of encouraging them to break out.
Okay. Well, Shanta, thank you so much for this work. It's worth seeing. It's really fun, as well as really thoughtful and compelling. Thank you so much for that in our chat today.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me.
The Dark Goddess exhibition runs until the end of the year. Admission to the Fleming Museum is free, and you can visit their website for hours and details. And that is our show for today. Thank you for joining us across the fence. I'm Fran Stoddard. Stay well.